Now, as you all know, the Act came into force on the 1st of October 2010. It brought together 116 pieces of legislation, and it provided a unified legal framework to protect the rights of individuals. And it should promote a fair and more equal society with equality of opportunity. So, 10 years on, are we there? Are you standing on the cusp of your legal career, about to enter professional life in a meritocracy? Or are you about to enter one that is pervaded by systemic discrimination? Last year, the spotlight was on women in the law with the centenary of the Sex Disqualification Removal Act of 1919, not an act that trips off the tongue. And we have seen the Me Too movement and Black Lives Matter gaining global traction. And I was looking back at the BSB, and in September 2016, they produced the professional statement for barristers. And that says, from day one of practice, barristers are to be aware and active in the pursuit of equality and respect for diversity, not tolerating unlawful discrimination in themselves or others. They will understand the law on equality and the need to value differences between members of society and apply that understanding in the workplace, through taking positive steps to confront and tackle discrimination, whether in themselves, in others, or in the structures of that workplace. So, to discuss whether the reality and the theory are the same, there are a distinguished panel of barristers this evening, and they are Zeenat Islam. Zeenat is a barrister at 25 Bedford Row. She is currently instructed as junior counsel to the Grenfell Tower inquiry. Zeenat is an associate tutor at the University of Warwick, where she teaches on the practical advocacy module for LLB students. She is a speaker, trainer, founder of Youth Inspire and Redefined Learning for Lawyers, which aims to widen access by access initiatives for individuals from underrepresented, minoritized and disadvantaged backgrounds. And Zeenat has been recognised in a number of awards for her work, including winning the highly commended award for outstanding contribution to diversity and inclusion, Future Leader in the UK Chambers 2019 awards, and being a finalist in the UK Legal Diversity Awards, Baton Awards and the Asian Legal Awards. Andrew Rhodes is a member of the Executive Committee of Neurodiversity Law. He's a pupil barrister at No. 5 Chambers, specialising in employment and discrimination, personal injury and clinical negligence law. And Andrew has autism. He has been diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome. And prior to coming to the bar, he worked in policy and campaigns for both Mind and the National Autistic Society. Chris Loweth was called in 1996 and is currently Head of Legal and Business Affairs at BBC Global News, a BBC commercial subsidiary responsible for the BBC World News TV channel, BBC.com and the BBC News and Sport apps outside the UK. Prior to this, he was legal advisor to the producers of the opening and closing ceremonies for the London 2012 Olympic and Paralympic Games, was head of content legal advice at Channel 5, has worked at TV production companies and other broadcasters. He's a member of the BBC staff LGBTQ+ network, BBC Pride, and last but not least, a member of the Lincoln's Inn Equality and Diversity Steering Group. And Brie Stevens-Hoare QC. Brie was called to the bar in 1986 and took silk in 2013. And she specialises in property and private client disputes. She won Barrister of the Year at the Modern Law Awards in 2019 and the Chambers UK's Real Estate Silk of the Year in 2017. Brie is a tribunal judge and JAC commissioner. She's also an advocacy and ethics trainer for Lincoln's in and is also a member of the steering group. And Brie identifies as pansexual and is one of the founders of Free Bar, which is a network for barristers and those working in the community who are LGBT+ and their allies. So that is the extremely illustrious panel we have this evening. And Brie, if I can start with you. You were called in 1986. I don't need to keep on barking on about that date.
Long time ago.
But to ask you frankly, have you experienced direct discrimination during your career?
Absolutely. You know, the usual stuff as you experienced as a woman at the bar in the 80s and 90s, patronised, it felt like pretty well every judge and every opponent. Big part of the experience was being very rarely working with other women. Female opponents were very welcome faces to come across. But I suppose the specific was the sort of level of banter that had to be absorbed. And for me, being explicitly propositioned in a situation where I'd been asked by a barrister to help on a case while I was still in pupillage that was out of town, turn up at a hotel, we have adjoining rooms booked, and he materialised in my room and proceeded to proposition me. I did manage to repel that approach and move on. I also had an occasion which was well into the 90s when a female client for a female representative of a commercial client on a case I'd been working on for a long period of time. We finally had a face-to-face conference anticipating a trial, and I was sacked 2 days later. And the female solicitor told me that the reason was because I was female, and that the representative of the client didn't believe I could be aggressive enough in court, and therefore I was sacked. So that's pretty direct.
Obviously doesn't know women then.
Or you or me, Karen.
And have you seen, I mean, you talked about early days pupillage and 1990. Have you seen the incidences of discrimination change in number or type? We say move up to now. And I know you have the luxury, you're a senior barrister now, so you have some protection.
Yeah, I think the answer to that is both yes and no. That for me personally, obviously I now have the privilege of seniority, and that, and because I'm older and fatter and all the rest of it, I'm not the target in the same way that I was. And I think I'd allowed myself quite a while to think that things really had changed, as in that sort of thing doesn't happen anymore, which was very naive because I didn't discuss it openly with people. And why would I think that other people had, and therefore I would be aware? So I've become aware since doing more and more with students. It hasn't gone completely, but I think the worst end of it and the more explicit and overt has reduced significantly. What I think is very difficult is that people know now that those sort of behaviours are absolutely not acceptable, but it doesn't necessarily mean all the hearts and minds have been changed and the discrimination isn't still there. It's just operating in more subtle ways, ways that are harder to evidence, ways that are harder to challenge, if that makes sense.
So more insidious then, in terms of trying to, like a weed, wrench it out from the root so that it doesn't come back.
Yeah, so I would say we've made progress, but actually in some ways we have the hardest bits of the job still to do.
Yeah, thank you for that, Brie. Perhaps turning Zeenat to you. So a big question for you though, are there structural issues at the bar that you think act as an impediment to entry to the profession?
Thanks, Karen. Yeah, big question there. I think for me, the starting point is to always remember that the bar is a microcosm of wider society, and issues in society also exist at the bar, and we're not somehow immune to any of those issues by virtue of being a profession that is about justice, which I guess on some level is quite ironic. And we often hear rose-tinted views about, you know, everybody can be a lawyer, you just need to work hard, get good grades, put your head down. And I have trouble with that narrative, because that can make rejection feel like the issue is the individual. And to all of the aspiring barristers here today, I want to tell you that it is not you. You know, racism, sexism, classism, ableism, homophobia, amongst many others, are all very real systemic issues at the bar. And when dealing with and speaking at webinars like this with aspiring barristers, one of the statistics that always really gets me, and it's from the BSB's 2019 diversity statistics, is the one that says that BPTC graduates with a 2-1 and a very competent at BPTC, 44% of those from white backgrounds had commenced pupillage. But students from BAME backgrounds with exactly the same degree and bar school grade, only 23% had commenced pupillage. And I always find that really shocking. And it just reiterates, I think, in a really stark way, that the bar is not a meritocracy, and the idea that it is simply a myth. And the sad reality is that some things are just more difficult for some of us. And I think it's positive that, you know, we're having these discussions, we're moving in the right direction. But one of the things that I think is an issue that remains is that sometimes the equality, diversity, inclusion narrative and the emphasis is sometimes misplaced. Sometimes I feel like we're focusing on dealing with the outcome of the issue rather than the actual issue itself. So, for example, focusing on getting more people from diverse backgrounds into chambers. But I think the question we should be asking is, well, why are those people underrepresented to begin with? And I think we need to be looking at society more broadly, and also just need to understand that actually diversity in and of itself is not a synonym for justice. It doesn't mean just because we've got more diverse faces or backgrounds in an organisation that overnight it's suddenly become equal, accessible and inclusive. I feel like it's a very on-trend kind of conversation at the moment, diversity, inclusion, equality. And whilst it's great we're having those conversations, what I really would like to see more of is these types of conversations where we're engaging with it sincerely and meaningfully from the root to the branch, rather than just looking at the symptoms. Often, in my experience, I've often felt that the equality conversation sometimes feels like a fluffy add-on, sometimes when we come to policies and committees and things like that. And just the last point on this, when I was reflecting in preparation for this session, was just to think about our own role as lawyers within this profession. I think it's really easy for us to become institutionalized within the profession, and sometimes we ourselves are contributing to upholding systems of power, privilege, whether that's in chambers, firms, membership organizations, and so on. And I think the real kind of reflected question for us as lawyers is to really think about, you know, what are we doing and what more can we do to kind of advance this conversation, more than just talking about it, but what practical actions, what are we doing to support colleagues from these different backgrounds, what changes are we making within our organizations. And so, yeah, there's a lot there, but those are a few of my reflections in terms of that.
And do you think that it would assist if data and collection and analysis was more sophisticated? Because one of the problems I have is just using broad categories to describe, say, BAME, yeah, or people of colour. I mean, using a label to categorise huge sections of society in a particular way, but that doesn't really define who they are. I can't define who they are. It's one tiny characteristic. Do you see that there is a problem with the data that or the very limited data that we're using?
Absolutely. And I think it's a difficult one, because on the one hand, having the kind of monitoring and seeing what's going on is useful, because we're able to see, okay, what progress or not is being made. But then the barometers of what we're using in terms of what the categories are very problematic. BAME is one of my pet hates, and you know, there are a number of issues with it, because you're assuming that anybody who's not white just gets shoved into this category, but it negates the very real and different lived experiences of the different people that fall within that category. And even when you look at the disaggregated data about BAME barristers, for example, it looks quite high in that it's 13.6%. But then when you break that down, for example, I'm of Bangladeshi origin, and the percentage from my background is much, much lower than, for example, the percentage of Indian barristers or Pakistani barristers. And obviously, we know in terms of Black practitioners, it's particularly low. And I think the danger of shoving everybody into this one category is that actually we're masking progress that hasn't actually been made, in addition to taking away from individual experiences, because whilst we might have commonalities in our struggles, there are also very different issues. My struggles as a brown Muslim woman are going to be very different to the experiences of a Black man in London today. And these types of broad categories don't assist with those nuances.
Yeah, thank you for that, Zeenat. Perhaps moving to another protected characteristic using the language of the Act. Chris, another, I guess, hard-hitting question for you, but what impact has your sexuality had on your career or your career path?
It's difficult to know directly what the impact of my sexuality has had. So I can only speak from kind of the experiences I've had and how I think they shaped my career. I started, and I guess this is a thing with all of the hidden characteristics, if you like. If you look at someone, it's usually not easy to tell what their sexuality is. And so it's harder for someone to say, well, we're going to discriminate against you on the grounds of your sexuality, unless you actually tell them what your sexuality is. And certainly that was my experience during bar school, but moreover in pupillage. So I was coming to terms with my sexuality when I was at bar school. It was probably December, the end of December, when I finally came out to one of my friends. So that's kind of, for those of you on the course now, in 2 months' time, that's kind of where I started dealing with that. And then so it was during my first year, well, my year of pupillage, that I was really out to some of my friends, but still dealing with the whole issue myself. And obviously that is the time that you are on display the whole time. You are in, if you're fortunate enough to get a pupillage, you're in chambers, you're on display, and everyone is assessing you all day, every day, or at least that's what it feels like. And because I was unsure of how my sexuality would be, I mean, I hadn't even told my parents at this point. And so to still be hiding that from everyone in chambers made it a very uncomfortable position for me to be in. And that was partly a choice of my own, because I wasn't feeling comfortable to be out to everyone else. But there was also that feeling of how do I think this is going to be received if I tell somebody that I'm gay? And so I probably wasn't myself throughout my pupillage. And I think that is the reason, or a large part of the reason, that I wasn't offered tenancy at the end of it. And I was in a provincial set of chambers where at the time it was far more likely, in fact it was assumed, that if you'd done pupillage there, you would be offered tenancy, because they took very few pupils at the time. So, and then when I did eventually come out towards the end of my pupillage to a couple of people who I thought would be trusted people that I could confide in, within 24 hours, everybody in chambers knew. And suddenly I was faced with having to go and tell people in chambers something that was very personal, that was, yes, I'm gay, and it's not an issue for me, and I hope it's not for you. And on the face of it, people were saying, oh yeah, no, it's fine. When it came to my pupillage decision as to whether I'd be tenancy, it clearly wasn't fine. And that some people would say it was because I hadn't been myself throughout my year of pupillage, to that I would countenance that's because I didn't feel able to be myself because of the environment and the atmosphere in chambers. So in terms of whether I would have carried on practicing at the self-employed bar, I don't know, had my experience been different, but certainly I don't feel I was given the opportunity to figure out whether it was for me, because the decision was taken away from me when I wasn't offered tenancy.
Gosh, I mean, I know it's a long time ago for me and a career now, but I cannot begin to imagine the pressure you were under during pupillage, because that is a hard and harsh year where you are on display actually for 12 months. You're performing. You can't let your guard down. You've got to perform to the best of your possible ability, and there you are, wrestling with quite life-changing views on who you are. So I suppose a problem in a way, Chris, is that actually people look at your career now, and as I went through your biog, I mean, you are clearly incredibly successful at what you do. I suppose people forget about the start in life and where you started from, and they look at you from where you are now.
Yeah, I think one of it is about, I think part of why I am where I am is because I'm confident, and I think you're only good at what you do if you have confidence in what you do and who you are. And I've only been able to become confident in my ability because of the environment that I've been surrounded by and the people around me. And it was interesting when I went back into change. So I was kind of found out, I don't know, Wednesday night I wasn't being kept on, wasn't being offered tenancy, but I was allowed to go back into chambers, to kind of just squat for a few months until I decided what I was doing. And I remember the following week going back for the first time and feeling a complete and overwhelming sense of relief, because suddenly I didn't care what any of them thought of me. I was able to be myself, and actually I had a really good 3 months in chambers, probably because I was bored being myself, but also I didn't care what other people felt. And it's about having the confidence to be yourself that enables you to do your best work and to be, have the best career that you can. And you can only be yourself if you are working in an inclusive environment. And if you're not, you will always be checking yourself. And that's why I think this is so important, because everyone needs to understand that you'll only be your best self if you have the space and the time and the ability to be there. And that only comes if everyone accepts you for who you are.
Yeah, I think probably in life, and I excuse sometimes bad behaviour in front of me in court, and that's because people aren't comfortable in their own skin and they don't have that confidence and being comfortable, so they are insecure, and that can lead to bad behaviour in some or ignorance in others. But often the root problem is chronic insecurity and not actually understanding who you are. Thank you, Chris, for that. Perhaps, Andrew, if I could bring you in at this point. I was looking today at the Family Resources Survey of 2018 and 2019, because obviously I've got nothing else to do on my half-term holiday. But I was looking at that survey. So that came out in March of this year, and that recorded that 19% of the working age adults reported a disability. And I just wondered, Andrew, how that compares to the statistics on barristers.
Well, thank you for that question. So looking at the Bar Standards Board's diversity report, their most recent one, of the people who completed that report, only 3.1% said they had a disability. So that's obviously significantly lower than the general population. Now, in terms of the reasons for that, well, disabled people are underrepresented in all aspects of employment. So, for example, autistic people in general, only 32% of them are in employment at all. Sorry, no, I've got that right. And only 16% of those are in full-time employment. Now, in terms of the challenges for the bar, I'm a member of the Executive Committee for Neurodiversity in Law, and what we're trying to promote is the idea that people with cognitive conditions such as autism, ADHD, dyspraxia, dyslexia, effectively have their own strengths and different ways of thinking, and that often there's a rigidity of approach which prevents them from effectively being able to show themselves to the best of their ability. And I'd like to emphasize something that Zeenat said, which is the importance of the bar being a microcosm of society as a whole. So if you have a society where a certain group is effectively underrepresented in a key profession like the bar, then that's going to have a serious impact on how the bar interacts with its clients, and ultimately how the judiciary, from whom, which takes most of its intake from the bar, ultimately decide cases and do their job. Now, it's a very difficult issue, I think, with disability. Primarily, well, in my case, it's a hidden disability. It's not something that people know about unless I tell them, and that's true of a lot of neurodiverse people. And obviously, there are different challenges for people who are wheelchair users. For example, the court estate and chambers aren't, as a rule, accessible to them. So that creates issues in and of itself. But for those who have hidden disabilities, certainly in the application process, both for pupillage and for tenancy, it's often very difficult, and it was difficult for me to decide whether you're actually going to share the fact that you are a disabled person. I never disclosed to any of the chambers that I applied for that I was disabled, and indeed I only told the chambers that I did pupillage at about 4 months into the process, and they were very supportive. They effectively got a consultant to look at what reasonable adjustments could be obtained for me. But the real issue for me is that I think with the bar, there's a real emphasis on ultimately, above everything else, ability. And there's often an assumption that goes with that disability equates to a lack of ability, when that's not true at all. Disabled people have a number of strengths. For example, autistic people are often highly driven and focused, with skills which directly transfer to the bar. But ultimately, people need to be able to ask for the right kind of support so that they can have careers at the bar. And that's not just in the application process for pupillage and tenancy, it's throughout their careers. And I think there is potentially an issue with the bar, which is, it does, from my limited experience so far, have a tendency to creep into aspects of your life. And if you're someone who, for example, as I sometimes do, needs downtime to recover from hearings and to recover from work, it's often very difficult, and this is true for people with caring responsibilities as well, to advance in the same way that someone without a disability advances. So I think that in some cases it's a lack of support, either because chambers haven't been told about a disability, or people aren't being supported in the way they should be, or potentially the nature of the profession, which I think is still, in the way that it's set up, slightly monomaniacal, in that it focuses you towards doing as much as you can, certainly in the early years when you're trying to impress people. And that can often be exclusionary to people who need different ways of working, or have caring responsibilities. Sorry,
carry on.
Slightly off the point. I think that as the bar reflects society's prejudices, it is ultimately ableist, as all of society is to a greater or lesser extent. And that necessarily means that until more people are aware of disabled people's needs, that it can be difficult for disabled people to participate in the same way that other people do.
And Andrew, I know you're at a very early stage of your career, but do you think even at this stage, with hindsight and given how chambers have reacted when you've told them about your disability in such a positive way, whether perhaps you should have said you had a disability when you were applying, and that might actually have assisted you to have a more equality of opportunity when it came to your interview process?
I mean, I would say yes. And part of the reason I would say yes is that you are entitled, if you're a disabled person, to reasonable adjustments. And if you don't tell, they can't provide them to you because they don't know. A question of being concerned as to how a chambers would take you revealing that you're a disabled person. But my view on that now is that if you were applying to a chambers who would look upon you less favourably as a disabled applicant, then ultimately you're better off not being at that chambers. So I would certainly advise having that discussion with chambers that you're applying to. I know some chambers actually have guaranteed interview schemes for disabled applicants who fit the criteria. And then ultimately, it can be a conversation between you and chambers as to what's the support you need, what you can offer chambers. But it's a difficult and it's a very personal question. I know some people's disabilities are more invasive than others, so the question will always
Ms. March, you're gone. If I can just stop you at that point, we'll come back to you in a little bit. And just turn to Zeenat again. And Zeenat, you described yourself as a brown Muslim woman. And I know from a conversation with you before this session that your faith is an important part of who you are. And I just wondered if there are aspects of your professional life that you find difficult to reconcile with your faith-based values. And by that, I'm thinking particularly, I remember when I was in practice, it seemed to be that the only way of marketing some people understood was without drinking, and alcohol seemed to be the common denominator in marketing. And it was a conversation I remember having in chambers about, well, is that right, actually? Does that provide equality of opportunity for members who don't drink, don't want to drink, may have caring responsibilities, don't actually want to spend the night marketing this services? So, if you've had to wrestle with that at all.
Yeah, thanks, Karen. I think the alcohol point has definitely been one that I've had to grapple with throughout my career so far. I think as a pupil, it was most challenging because, as we've already said today, a lot of being a pupil is about getting to know people in your chambers, making those relationships, being seen, being heard. And a lot of the social events at the bar are alcohol dominated. And so I had to, in my pupillage year, find a way of getting involved, but in a way that I didn't feel I was massively compromising, although I still did feel compromised. So my way of doing things as a pupil was probably like going to show my face, having a lemonade, staying for half an hour and then leaving, which some people may have perceived as, oh, she's no fun, she's just going off. But for me, that was kind of my way of trying to find a balance. What has changed since being a tenant in my courage and conviction to just be who I am and not feel like I've got to do things that I just don't want to do, and having more confidence to have those conversations with colleagues and explaining the reason why. I do think that this has come at sacrifice, because I think one thing that's absolutely clear is that a lot of these social events, they're with solicitors, it's about building professional relationships but in a social setting. And I definitely feel that I've not had the same perhaps opportunities in that sense. And it has felt quite isolating because, everybody might be talking about going to an event or a chambers event or whatever it might be, and you're kind of the only person perhaps that's not there. I, for example, am the only Muslim in my chambers at the moment. And often even having the conversations, there are some people that truly do get it, because alcohol isn't just a faith-based thing. As you've said, people just choose not to drink for various reasons. And there are other people that just don't understand it at all and will constantly ask, you know, why don't you drink? Like, what's that about? And sometimes I think that those questions, there's nothing harmful in them at all, and people genuinely just don't get it. But other times I do wonder whether the repeated kind of questions is couched in something a bit more sinister. And I say that only because I've suffered Islamophobic abuse as well during my time at the bar, and had quite specific comments targeted at me. So it's a difficult one. And one positive thing that I saw, and I think it would be great if the bar followed suit, is the Law Society's Junior Lawyers Division, January of this year, released a survey which was about creating a healthy alcohol culture. And it was really great because it suggested loads of alternative things that organisations could do. So, you know, lunch and learn events, coffee mornings, having an alcohol policy in chambers. And I think some of that would be a really good step in the right direction. And I think one silver lining of COVID, which has been a really challenging time, but one good thing that I out of it is a lot of these virtual meetups, and, you know, being able to have lunches and stuff, virtual lunches, virtual coffees, and for people that might be worried about this aspect, I think the things to think about are maybe aligning yourself or joining groups that are aligned with your background or values. So for me, for example, I'm a part of the Association of Muslim Lawyers or the Muslim Lawyers Action Group, and getting involved and building relationships in other ways that's on your terms, or perhaps going to educational events that might be followed by a drinks reception, but that you can choose what bit you stay for, how long you stay, like that. So I guess the answer really is yes, I've struggled with it. I have tried to find a balance. I do think it's isolating. It still is 7 years in. But I think the fact that we're even having this conversation is a positive step in the right direction.
And it's clearly a work in progress, and something that has to change fundamentally as an ethos for practice. But you mentioned about talking to colleagues, but clearly clerks, practice managers, chambers directors all have to be part of that journey. Have you had those conversations with those people?
I haven't had those conversations with those people, but on the back of the stuff that happened this summer, one of the positive things that we've done in Chambers is set up a equality diversity committee. Before, we just had equality officers. So what we've tried to do is kind of get a committee around this issue. And one of the things that I'm now a part of this committee, and that's one of the things that we've raised on our action plan. So we're hoping that the incidents of this summer, that although they're, you know, it came on the back of the BLM movement, actually it's opened up much wider and deeper conversations, which I think is a good thing. And I'm hoping that that will take off in some way.
Right. Well, thanks, Zeenat, for that. I suppose, Chris, looking at inclusivity, which is the thread that has to run through all of this. I know it's 20 years since you recalled broadly. Again, I'm being positively ageist during this forum today. How do you think the profession has changed? If you trace it back from back to pupillage, to the introduction of the 2010 Act, to today?
I think, I mean, first of all, I should say that, you know, I found like-minded people at Lincoln's Inn immediately in my bar school year, and that helped me enormously. So I've never experienced any homophobia at the inn at all, and you know, sort of being involved with the steering group now, it's really, I kind of feel, you know, emboldened and enthused that the inn is taking this so seriously, and the fact that we're, you know, doing a session like this, and that hopefully as the people, everyone on this session today goes into the profession, it will become more of an issue. And in terms of people will take it seriously, and that is because of the Act. You know, the only reason that we are having these discussions, that equality, diversity and inclusion are at the top of everyone's agenda, it can be traced back, I think, to the change that the Act brought in bringing all those different pieces of legislation together under one umbrella that made everybody realise that they had to take equality seriously. So yes, I think it has changed. I think the issue we still have now is to get everybody engaged and interested in it. And if you look at the number of people who still don't answer the Bar Standards Board's diversity questionnaire every year, or just don't give the information. I'm just looking at the numbers now, and more than 50% of people who complete the questionnaire prefer not to say what their sexuality is. And I know why, because I've heard it, and this is not at the bar, this is across all organisations. People think, what's it got to do with them, what my sexuality is? Well, it's important because people people who are experiencing discrimination, we can't help them, we can't change things unless we know exactly what the percentage of underrepresented groups, protected characteristics are in an organisation, are in a profession, so we can work out where to target the action that we need to take. And it's something that we're looking at the Inn now, is developing an action plan for what we can do to improve diversity at the Inn. But it's really hard for us to do that in a vacuum because we don't actually know what the diversity across the Inn is like at the moment. And so, yes, we've come some way in that we're now talking about it and it's now taken as important, but we've still got a long way to go because not everyone really gets that it is important still. People know that you can't overtly discriminate against people, that you can't, it's unacceptable to make certain comments or treat people in a certain way, but they still don't quite get that the impact that diversity and feeling included can have on people who don't feel included and what they can do to change it. And I think we've seen a change to some extent in that this year with the Black Lives Matter movement and the conversations we're having around that, but there's still a long way to go.
Thank you, Chris, for that. I suppose following that thread, Andrew, if I come back to you, what do you think going forward needs to change in the profession?
Well, I think it's important that certainly in recruitment and monitoring of retention, that chambers record data, both for disabled people and for other protected characteristics, to see whether ultimately the people that they're recruiting and who become members of chambers and hopefully stay as members of chambers reflect society as a whole. I think that's one important step. I also think that it's important that chambers, when thinking on how to retain members of the bar, don't make assumptions about how what the ideal barrister is and what standards they should be expected to attain in terms of how they manage their work, whether they take time off, what kind of support they need. I think certainly from a disability perspective, that the most important thing is that chambers are willing to listen to applicants and to pupils, to junior tenants, about what they need to ultimately succeed at the bar, and are willing to be open-minded about that. And I think I don't think this is widespread, but if disability no longer is seen as being less able, but in fact a difference, and in fact potentially a strength, then hopefully those numbers which I quoted when I first spoke will improve.
So taking from that, the key in all of this is I think twofold. One, data. We need data. We need to analyse the data, and inclusivity.
Yes, I think that's important, and I think things like equality committees and open discussions about what people with protected characteristics can bring both to individual chambers and to the bar as a whole is important, and it stops being seen as sort of, as Zeenat said, effectively an add-on, but is integral to the way in which chambers work.
Thank you, Andrew. And Brie, again, following that theme through, have you seen behavioural change in those around you?
Yes, definitely. I think there's been a significant change in the behaviour of the majority, including the majority of straight white men that I have worked with and around and come across constantly in the course of my professional life. And I think that's partly because society's changed, and change in society, you can have a big debate whether statute or shifts in culture without statute make a difference. But, you know, some change is driven first by statute and culture follows, sometimes the other way around. But I think as lawyers, we're perhaps that bit more aware of statute. So I think things like the various bits of legislation that came before us in the Equality Act set a scene, set a standard that lawyers are particularly aware of. But I think also the presence and the visibility of people from groups who are underrepresented, be they specifically with protected characteristics or not, makes a big difference. And that visibility may be because of data, it may be because their difference is visible, it may be because they become louder about the difference. But the fact that there is a wider range of difference, even if it's not a critical mass in the room, and an increasing number of even people who don't have difference, who are the traditional image of a barrister as it was when I came to the bar, but who actually have an understanding and have a connection and feel invested in people with difference who will challenge something, means that people think and check their behaviour. And you can see it's taken more seriously because of the huge amount of work that is done about equality, diversity and inclusion at entry level. And for me, I think we're at a critical point. In the last few years, people have started to talk and get their heads around and come to understand intersectionality in this context and start to appreciate, as was being talked about earlier, that actually you can't lump everyone who's a person of colour as one group and assume that their lived experience and the barriers they face are the same. And that some people have a combination of factors, and that plays out in a different way. The bar is starting to talk about that and starting to realise that actually it's not just about entry level, it's about progression and retention if we're really going to change. What I look forward to is when we start having a discussion about whether we really have meritocracy or we're just rewarding those who are loudest and work longest, as opposed to actually looking at quality.
A way to go on that yet. I suppose it's incredibly helpful for you to mention intersectionality, because that seems to be something where there is greater awareness that you don't have just a box that you satisfy a box. I'm a woman, therefore I go in that box. This is how you deal with that box, therefore it's sorted. There's no discrimination.
I mean, I regularly get asked, Brie, where are all the lesbians? As someone who's lived in, I'm just saying, 2 lesbian relationships for the last 25 years. And the answer is, for many women who are lesbians, I have enough to deal with being a woman at the bar. I'm not going to add that extra layer to it. But that is changing, and people are feeling increasingly comfortable to be themselves in the way that Chris talked about.
And that also goes back to the issue about hidden characteristics as well, ones that are not obvious. And I think this picks up from what Andrew has been saying as well, that there is a very slow move, but a move towards people feeling comfortable enough and in a safe space where they can actually talk about those hidden characteristics, because it is who they are. And why shouldn't, if they choose to, have who they are as a person being presented, rather than this, I don't know, shop front, which is dressed for the purposes of display for those walking past.
Absolutely. So I always think it's very telling when you look at the diversity statistics that are produced by the Bar Council and the BSB, to look at the same time at the proportion of people who prefer not to disclose. And those shift dramatically across different questions. Gender, the vast majority of responders will disclose. Disability, there's always a huge proportion. Sexuality, a huge proportion who elect not to, which for me is an indicator of them not feeling at home, not feeling comfortable in the space.
Thank you, Brie. Right, I see that time is marching on, so I'm going to ask each of the panels, apart from the fact that I assume you're going to give us the remedy for solving this problem and the cure-all for it, but if I ask each of you to tell everyone, the audience that's listening, that what should people as individuals be doing to make a difference? And if I ask Andrew, what would you say that people as individuals should be doing to make a difference?
I think the first thing is to talk about their experiences. Certainly, I think a large part of accepting diversity is appreciating differences and different points of view, and often either because certain things aren't visible, for example, if you have a hidden disability or sexuality, people just don't know, or people have assumptions which are just wrong in relation to other protected characteristics. I think the most important thing is to normalize difference and to have conversations with those around you, whether they're friends, professional colleagues, and so that ultimately people come to understand that you don't need to fit a particular sort of stereotype of what a barrister looks like to have a successful career at the bar. And hopefully, although I suspect it would take some time, that will lead to people's assumptions changing and there being an ultimately more tolerant and more inclusive and more diverse bar.
Thank you, Andrew, for that. And the same question to you, Zeenat. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
Yeah, I've got 5 things which I'll go through really quickly because I'm conscious of the time. First one, I think we all need to remember our own humanity first and approach other people with a bit more compassion and kind of step outside of ourselves. Secondly, I think we all have work to do in terms of educating ourselves on issues maybe we're not comfortable with or familiar with. Often the onus falls on the impacted group or people to do the kind of legwork, and I think that burden needs to change. 3, I think we need to get comfortable with being uncomfortable and learning to sit with that. And if we're being challenged on particular viewpoints or whatever it might be, that's okay. We don't have to be defensive. Number 4, I think we need to be prepared to unlearn some of the things that we've, I think, been conditioned to think, and rethink some of that, and also reflect on our own privilege. And lastly, similar to what, a more of a willingness to engage with these issues, but in a genuine way, rather than this performative, fluffy add-on type way.
Thank you, Zeenat. Brie, what do you have to add?
Everything Zeenat said.
Yep.
But I would say also be allies. So whoever you are, if you're in the room and hear an attack or a comment or something that is off so far as a group that is not you, because it's been said while you're in the room, call it out. You know, there is nothing more powerful than having someone who is not a part of the group that's being commented on say to someone who is also not, actually, I think that's a bit off. I'm not comfortable with you saying that. So we can all be allies to each other.
Yeah, thank you, Brie. And Chris, last but not least, what do you want to add?
I think just the acceptance that this is all of our problem. It's not a problem for women that they aren't don't have the advancement with the profession that they deserve. The problem is with the men who haven't allowed them to get there. It's not the problem for disabled people that they don't have the access that they are entitled to or deserve. It's the people that haven't provided them with the access that's a problem. So you know, and I've seen it before where you kind of say, well, the way to deal with the issues of the gender imbalance at the bar is to send the women on courses to encourage them to be more like men, to be more confident, to be more loud, to be more whatever. And it's kind of, the issue's not with them, they're just being themselves. The issue is to stop the men from behaving in such a way that excludes the women. So, and it goes for all of the protected characteristics, and it goes back to what Zeenat said. It's about all of us need to educate ourselves as to what we don't know, because then we'll be better at understanding the differences that other people have.
Thank you, Chris. I guess all of the points each of you have made with that final question makes me think of an interview that I was listening to earlier, which was given by Francesca Howard to the BBC, and that was in the context of Black Lives Matter movement. And she said, by having constructive conversations and educating each other and not tearing people down, that is how we are going to move forward. And I think that rather neatly summarises the message that each of you have been giving to the audience today. And just before we go to the breakout rooms, can I say thank you very much to the panellists for having a full and frank conversation tonight about the matters that affect you in practice. And I can only believe that it will help those on the cusp of their legal careers to have heard you speak so passionately and eloquently about such matters. So thank